Hey, it's me, Nalthazar, and welcome to another Magic the Gathering Puzzle Quest video. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the rares, uncommons, and commons that you're going to want to keep your eye out for and collect from the upcoming set Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So, let's get into it. Now, I'm not saying that these are necessarily chase cards because it's more difficult to chase a common, uncommon, or a rare in that we don't have a system that just targets like a small pool of commons or a small pool of uncommons or a small pool of rares. But that said, as you're opening your packs, you're going to want to keep your eyes out for these cards because these are cards that I think you're going to get a lot of play out of. Interestingly, this is a set where I think you're going to get a lot more play out of the commons, uncommons, and rares than you will out of the mythics. I think there's one mythic that I actively want to chase, which is that white support that draws cards and gives mana. But otherwise, I really am looking for the commons, uncommons, rares, and masterpieces from this set. So it's kind of an odd set in that regard. The first of the rares is Adeline Resplendent Cathar. So Adeline is a 9 mana 0/4 with Vigilance. This is a card that I really see as more of a card for newer players. It's not one for necessarily people in the platinum ranks, but if you manage to pull this card in like bronze, silver, gold, then you're going to be able to get a lot of value out of this card. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, create 2 human tokens. And then this creature gets +X/+0 until the beginning of your next turn. X is the number of creature cards you control up to 6, including their reinforcements. So 9 mana for potentially a 6/4 that can't reinforce to improve its own power isn't all that great on its own, but being able to create those 2 human tokens every single turn means that if you happen to have a planeswalker like the Grandmaster of Flowers, which is absolutely going to be, I think, an S-tier planeswalker with the standard shift, then you could just use this in conjunction with the Grandmaster of Flowers to get 14/14 flying first strike vigilance worth of tokens with the way that his third works in changing base power toughness. So I honestly think that this card is going to be very useful for you newer players just because it has a consistent form of token production that simply requires it to be on the battlefield. Think Thopter Spy Network or something like that. The second card, Angel Fire Ignition, I think will get more play from people regardless of rank. It's an 11 mana spell that gives a creature you control +2/+2 and vigilance permanently. Then it gives the creature trample, lifelink, and haste until end of turn. So the really nice thing about this card is that Shadow Spear is rotating out. And so red as a color is going to really struggle to gain life without access to Shadow Spear. And so you're going to be able to throw this into your Brokon decks, into your Bolas decks, although Bolas has a number of ways of gaining life. You're going to be able to throw it into your Koth decks. Whatever it is that you want to throw this into, it's going to give you a way to buff your creatures and gain life, which is going to definitely be useful. Do I think it's going to be a great card? No. If it didn't have flashback, I'd be a little bit less interested in it, but because it has that flashback and buried mechanic, I'm really excited to try out the whole flashback buried deck idea, and so this card definitely stands out to me for that. I don't think it's one of the more powerful rares in the set. It's one of the ones that I considered leaving off the list, but it's still one that I think could have a lot of use for a lot of players. This next card, Fateful Absence, is one of the cards that I want most from the set. It's a 7 mana spell that destroys an opposing vanguard, and if not, it destroys an opposing creature and your opponent investigates. So the reason I want this card so badly is 7 mana for a kill spell is very reasonable, and this gives white a very little risk kill spell. Just directly kill something. Most people don't run vanguards, and if they do, then you're going to be able to use this to get rid of those vanguards. But most of the time that you play this card, it's just going to be a 7 mana to destroy target creature, which is absolutely huge. So I see this card as an absolutely must-have for anyone who's thinking that they're probably going to be playing with white with the standard shift. And I do think that white is going to be very strong, and one of the reasons is because this card is coming into existence. 7 mana for a kill spell is very, very good. Next card on the list is Galvanic Iteration. So this card is a 15 mana spell that gives the first spell in your hand that can gain mana, half of its mana. Then you copy that card, and that copy gains full mana. Think of this kind of like Kasmina's second ability on a card, right? Like you don't get the whole like gems all convert, but you're going to be giving a card mana, a spell mana, and you're going to be getting another copy of that spell and giving that copy full mana. And this is a card with flashback, so it's going to go to your graveyard and then potentially get cast again. So I see some pretty insane targets for this card, including things like Turntimber Symbiosis, which means that you use this and then all of a sudden you're going to be able to use 2 Turntimbers to get 2 creatures. There's a lot of options in the upcoming standard with regards to some pretty decent spells that you can use this with. You can use it to just get extra removal. You can use it for extra support removal, right? You could use it for extra card draw. There's a lot of different things that you could use this card for. And so I see this as being a card that will slot into a lot of decks. This is one of the cards that I am also very excited to have. It's one of the ones I'm definitely looking forward to pulling. Ghoul Caller's Harvest is more a card that I think is something that I will have fun with, but it could wind up being incredibly strong. So it's 13 mana, it once again has Flashback and Buried, and it's going to create X Decayed Zombie tokens, where X is half of the number of creature cards in your graveyard, rounded up. So I'm really excited to try a Wrenn and 7 graveyard build, and there's a lot of black-green dual-colored graveyard mechanic cards in the set. Wrenn on its own is going to be milling 4 cards for every activation of the first ability. And so between that and cards like Gather the Pack that will dump 4 creatures into your graveyard, I could see you being able to make quite a few Decayed Zombies with this card. And if there are enough other cards that you throw into your deck that have flashback, then you're going to be able to get multiple castings of this card for every time that you use it. So I see this being really fun for that, and I see this potentially being really fun in, say, a Liliana Untouched by Death deck, because of, once again, the whole Flashback and Buried. So if you have enough black cards with Flashback and Buried, then you're going to wind up just spamming that first ability and getting free casts of Ghoul Caller's Harvest to get a whole bunch of free Decayed Zombie tokens. So I like zombie tokens. I really like that idea a lot. And so I like the idea of getting a bunch of them with this card, potentially twice. Next up on the list is Mask of Gristlebrand. This is a phenomenally powerful card. It is a 12 mana equipment. It has that whole when you attack with a creature, it gains 1 mana, and it has 3 shields. While it's on the board, your first creature gains flying and lifelink. So Shadow Spear rotates out, but we get this thing. Granted, we still have that uncommon Black Quill that gives your first creature +2/+2 and lifelink, but this, at least for me, is going to be even better. Because it also has, when your first creature dies, you may lose life equal to that creature's power. If you do, draw X cards, and then those cards gain X mana, where X is the amount of life you lost this turn. So I know that I've mentioned between the last video on the Mythics and Masterpieces and now this one, Liliana Death's Majesty a few times, but Liliana Death's Majesty's first ability, Anoint, is going to destroy a creature you control, and then have it come back to the battlefield and turn into a zombie and get a power toughness buff. So with this card, you just basically anoint your first creature, and then if it's a powerful enough creature, you're going to fill out your hand with cards, and then those cards are going to gain full mana, and you're going to be able to just cast all of them because you use loyalty before you make your match. And then on top of that, this is going to give your first creature flying and lifelink, so all that life that you would potentially be losing by using the mask to lose life and draw cards is going to come back from the lifelink anyway. So I'm really excited about this card. This card seems really, really cool. Old Stick Fingers. So this is another one that I considered leaving off the list because it didn't stand out as much to me. However, I've loved using Garuda so much that it may wind up being a card that I fall in love with, just like I did with Garuda. So this is 13 mana for a 1/1. It has 5 stored mana, so you can pay up to 5 additional mana upon casting this, up to 18 total mana, to get the extra benefit of the stored mana. So when this creature enters the battlefield, you're going to destroy the top X cards of your library, where X is equal to the card's stored mana. That means that you're going to be able to destroy up to 5 cards from the top of your library for casting this, or having it enter the battlefield. Then at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each creature in your graveyard, this creature gets +1/+1 until the beginning of your next turn. So the reason why I was thinking of not adding this is because I'm not 100% sure if the stored mana is just going to stay on this at 5 when you've cast the first one, and then if things like Turn Timber Symbiosis and Prismatic Bridge and Reanimator effects will wind up making it so that every subsequent Old Stick Fingers that comes back onto the battlefield is going to mill 5 more cards, or if those cards that enter the battlefield without storing mana first will mill 0. If that's the case, then I probably will not use Old Stick Fingers at all. However, if that is the case, then as in if it does continue to mill, then I probably will use it a fair bit. The other downside to this one is that it really doesn't have a very large power toughness potential, just because if you're playing a green-black deck destruction deck, you're probably going to be using some kind of Reanimator as well. And so you're going to be putting creatures into your graveyard, but then you're going to be bringing them back from the graveyard as well. So I mentioned the pros and cons of this one while still including it because this could actually wind up being a phenomenal card. It's just I have to see if that stored mana will count once you've cast one or not. Next up is Rem Carlos, Stalwart Slayer. So Carolus is a 2/3 flying first strike for 11, and while on the battlefield, your creatures gain prevent damage. Furthermore, when another source you control deals damage to your opponent's planeswalker, deal 2 damage to your opponent's planeswalker. So this one is cool for a number of reasons. First one is while it's on the battlefield, all of your creatures gain prevent damage, including Rem Carlos. So the new Sigarda, I think it was, is going to have she's going to give all of your other creatures prevent damage, but she doesn't get prevent damage. Whereas this one gives all of your creatures prevent damage, including it. So if you're running a bunch of white weenie cards that are going to be having vigilance or whatnot, then this card is going to be an absolute standout card. I love that this is a card that any player with Origins Gideon can pick up and then just start dominating with, because this thing is going to have prevent damage. You use Gideon's first ability to give it vigilance. It already has flying, and now it's going to be able to block anything that your opponent sends its way. They will have to play a removal spell. So for a lot of PvE events, and then even for the Dragon node on the Tiamat Dragon node on the that recent event from the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, this card, if you have it, is going to be a phenomenal way for you to be able to just completely trash that node. So beyond that, it has that whenever another source you control deals damage to your opponent's planeswalker, there's a common that has casting a spell deal damage directly to your opponent's planeswalker. And so if you were to run this with that as an example, anytime that you would cast a spell and you could just create some kind of ridiculous spell chain, you could wind up pinging your opponent to death with the ability. Beyond that, being able to do an extra 2 damage for every creature you control is very solid. So this is a card that I think will have some niche play up in Platinum, but outside of Platinum is going to be an absolute game-changing card and a massive bomb threat that will enable newer players to tackle some of the more challenging content in the game. So I do very much like that this card is coming in with its abilities. Next up is Rite of Harmony. So this is an 8 mana support. It has Buried 9, so it can be cast from the graveyard. It has 2 shields. And when a creature or enchantment card comes into play under your control, draw a card. At the end of your turn, this support loses 1 shield. And then if this card is in your graveyard casting a spell, this card gains 2 mana. So the more that I look at this card, the more that I wish that it had a 3rd shield instead of 2 shields. Just because I see this as being a card that will pair very well with Nissa Worldwaker. The only problem with this in conjunction with Nissa Worldwaker is that you're probably going to be running a bunch of gem conversion. And so when you're using your first ability, if you've got Rite of Harmony down, it's going to draw you 4 cards as well as giving you the 4 tokens as well as then converting the gems, because the creatures are going to enter the battlefield before the gems get converted. I've been thinking a lot about some of the cards that we've had in the past that have been able to draw us cards whenever creatures enter the battlefield, and those cards have been very strong. This card has that limiter in that it loses the 1 shield at the end of each of your turns, And so if you wind up playing this, you'll play it, but you're probably not going to be able to activate a loyalty ability because you'll have needed to have gotten a 5 match and then play this and then activate the loyalty ability to ensure that you will be able to activate said loyalty ability. Because once your turn ends, this thing is going to potentially be on a green gem because it's white and green, and it's going to be at 1 shield unless you've cast multiple copies of it. The plus side is that you're probably going to be running a bunch of spells in your deck, so you will be able to have this thing come back from the graveyard, and so you're going to ideally be able to get a lot of use out of it. It's just something that I'll have to try out. So it was originally one of the cards I was the most excited for, but now it's more one that I feel like I'm going to have to try out. And then once I have, it'll either be an amazing card that just becomes a mainstay in my Nissa decks, or it's going to be a card that I'll just use from time to time for giggles, but not a card that I will use with any consistency. Next up on the list is Slaughter Specialist. This is a 10 mana 3/3 Berserker with when this creature enters the battlefield, destroy the first opposing creature. Then create a human token under your opponent's control. When an opposing creature dies, this creature gets a permanent +1/+1 buff. Now this card I like for a number of reasons. The first is that it's a creature that is also a kill spell. The second is that it creates a token on the opponent's side of the battlefield that will enable you to get a second kill from being able to destroy one of their creatures, which is very good for destroy creature objectives. This means that if your opponent has even just one creature down, you play this, and you're going to be able to at least destroy 2 for 1. The next piece is that this has Berserker, and the token that is created on the opponent's side is a 1/1. So it is able to take care of the token that is created on the opponent's side of the battlefield. Furthermore, it buffs when something dies. So this is a 3/3. It's going to enter. It's going to destroy something. It's going to become a 4/4. It's going to swing, potentially kill the human token, become a 5/5. And then any other copy of Slaughter Specialist, or should I say Slafter Specialist, that you play is then going to be laughing at the Slafter and killing all of your opponent's stuff. Once again, I'm just going to throw this out there. You can pair this with Liliana Death's Majesty, use that first ability Anoint, and just flicker this basically every single turn to wipe out your opponent's board state, which once again, I think is an incredible combo. So I do quite like this card very much. It's one of the cards that I want more in the set. I'm thinking it's likely that Liliana Death's Majesty will be very good in this set. I think she's probably going to rise up on my tier list, but I'm definitely going to have to test her before I conclude that that is the case. Next up is Sludge Monster. This abomination is absolutely filthy. So it's 17 mana for a 5/5. It's a horror, and when this creature enters the battlefield or attacks, either one, target creature's base power toughness becomes 2/2. That creature loses all its basic evergreen abilities and gains the horror subtype. So this is ridiculous because it enters the battlefield and just immediately neuters one of your opponent's creatures. Then not only does it enter the battlefield and neuter one of your opponent's creatures, but then every time the thing attacks, it's going to continue to neuter your opponent's creatures. Let's say for a moment that your opponent is playing some kind of nasty dragon deck. Voila, all of those 9/9, 10/10 dragons are now 2/2s, which frankly are not even remotely scary. So Sludge Monster is going to be an absolute monster of a control card. It's absolutely filthy. It's going to be amazing. This is a card that I think it's going to give you headaches and fits because the thing permanently becomes that. So you have to kill your own creatures basically if you want their base power toughness to increase again. So even just killing the Sludge Monster won't be enough. So creatures that find a way to have some kind of lasting effect on the battlefield tend to be creatures that I wind up using a lot of. So this might be one of those creatures. Next up on the list is Unnatural Growth. Unnatural Growth took me a little bit by surprise. The effect of the card is exactly what I anticipated it would be, but being just a rare is kind of a surprise to me, especially after the masterpiece called Xenagos, God of Revels. So this card says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each creature you control, double that creature's power and toughness until end of turn. This basically is one of those sort of fiery emancipation cards where I don't see how you're going to be able to realistically use this thing in events because you'll just kill your opponent way too darn fast if you use this card. But to give you a frame of reference, Xenagos, God of Revels, was a phenomenal card that came out in the Theros Beyond Death set. It was a masterpiece, And it had at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets plus X, where X is that creature's power. So basically, it doubled the power of one of your creatures at the beginning of combat as a masterpiece for the same amount of mana as this, and was just an insanely powerful card. So, same amount of mana, same effect, but for all of your creatures. So, I see this as being an absolutely terrifying card. For those of you who make decks that do not fill objectives, you just make decks to go in events to mess with people, this is a card that's going to be absolutely terrifying for you to throw into your decks, and people will absolutely hate to run into this thing in events because it is really that strong. The final one of my rares is Wake to Slaughter. So this is a 15 mana spell. It is another one with Flashback and Buried. You pick one of the first 4 creature cards from your graveyard and move it into play under your control. It gains haste and enchanted. At the end of your opponent's turn, fetch the last creature card from your graveyard and exile this card. So basically, you reanimate one of the first 4 creatures. Ideally, it's going to have an enter the battlefield effect, or is just some kind of really strong beastie. It has haste, so it's going to swing and hit your opponent. Then at the end of your opponent's turn, you're going to fetch the last creature card from your graveyard and put it in your hand and exile the creature that you just brought onto the battlefield. So nonetheless, this is going to be just a phenomenal reanimator card, especially since this thing can be, in a way, reanimated itself with a bunch of flashback cards. And so just with the way that flashback seems to be working in this upcoming set, just because of how many cards there are with flashback that are actually quite decent, I am excited to use this card. It looks like my total cup of tea just because I really like that whole thing where you get the creatures back from the graveyard. Yeah, that's very much goodness. So that's it for the rares. Let's go into the uncommons. The uncommons for this set are really easy to go through because we only have a few and then we have a land cycle. So I always love land cycles, and so obviously they've made it onto my list. The first of the uncommons is Clear Shot. It's an 8 mana spell that says target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn, then deal damage equal to that creature's power to the first opposing creature. I always like me some removal, and while this is definitely not a removal card that I will use a lot of because green happens to have some straight up destroy creature going right now, for those of you that don't have those, this is a phenomenal alternative. 8 mana is very reasonably costed, and then this isn't even a fight effect, so your opponent's creature is not going to deal damage back. And because it deals damage to the first opposing creature, it will also bypass hexproof. So this is just going to be a solid removal card for those of you who need some more removal and don't have some of the better options at your disposal right now. The next card is Curse of Surveillance, and this card is just kind of crazy in how good it is. So it's a 3 mana support. It's an enchantment curse, and at the beginning of your opponent's turn, you draw X cards, where X is the number of curse supports you control, and then those cards gain Y mana, where Y is the number of enchantment supports you control. So at the very least, this is a 3 mana to draw a card and give it 1 mana every turn card, which is like unprecedented levels of card draw and mana gain for this mana. Like it's a really, really good card. Regardless of what your collection looks like, you're going to be able to throw this into decks. And if you wind up running other enchantment supports, or even if your Planeswalker's ability somehow is going to make an enchantment support, then you're going to be able to get even more mana on that card that you draw. If you wind up running more curses in your deck, then you're going to be able to draw multiple cards and give those cards a bunch of mana for having even more enchantment supports down. This card is going to be an enabler for a lot of decks, and so I absolutely love this card. This card is really, really good. This brings us to our land cycle. So they are all going to convert to 2 colors. So they're all going to have at the beginning of your turn, convert 2 gems to color or color. And then they are all going to have, when this support enters the board, if there are 10 or more of the color and colored gems on the board, all cards in your hand gain 5 mana. So this first one, Deserted Beach, is the white-blue one. So if there are 10 or more white-blue gems, you gain 5 mana. And at the beginning of your turn, it converts 2 gems to white or blue. The next one is going to be black or red. So same exact effect, but it'll be converting to black or red. Then we've got another one for green or white. Same sort of gem conversion, just for green and white. We've then got red and green. And then finally, we have blue and black. So we have our allied colors right there, all with a really nice new land cycle. The downside to this land cycle for me is that it costs 12 mana, but since this is an uncommon land cycle, having it cost a little bit more mana makes sense to me. Having an uncommon land cycle that costs just as much, if not less mana than the rare land cycle, it makes it so that the rare's land cycle is not quite like as standout from the uncommon one. But that said, I'm always good with there being more gem conversion in the game. The final one of our uncommons is just a very huge shocker to me. Like, this is better than like any of the mythics in the set. Like, I'd rather have this than any of the mythics. So this is a 10 mana spell with Convoke 5, so it costs 1 less for each creature and creature reinforcement you control up to 5, and then destroy all creatures. So this is just going to serve as a wonderful board wipe for only 10 mana, which is just so good. It just lets you reset the board for so little mana. I mean, the Sarah or Elspeth Sun's Champion are going to be able to cast this on a single white match to just wipe the board. So like I said, white is getting a massive boost with this set. It's just getting so many good support cards. And when I say support cards, I mean cards that will support your decks, not specifically supports. And Vanquish the Horde is absolutely one of them. This is one of the cards that I feel like I absolutely need to have in my collection. And if there was a way for me to target getting this and I didn't wind up pulling, then I would do that targeting method to get this card because I think it's really that good. So that's it for the uncommons. Let's move into the commons. The commons from this set are also going to be pretty straightforward as to why it is that I've selected them. So let's just go ahead and get right into them. The first one is Diregraph Rebirth. This is a 16 mana reanimator spell. So you pick one of the first 4 creature cards from your graveyard and move it into play under your control. Furthermore, it has flashback and buried, so not only are you going to be bringing creatures back from the graveyard, but you're going to be able to cast this potentially more than one time. This is an absolutely phenomenal card. I actually want this more than most of the mythics as well. Next up, we have Fading Hope. This is a 4 mana removal spell for blue, which is amazing. So 4 mana, choose target creature. If that creature's owner has 5 or less cards in hand, return that creature to its owner's hand. Then if that card's base cost is 9 or less, you may move the top card from your library to the bottom of your library. This card particularly stands out to me for a few reasons. First is that it's choose target creature, so you can choose your own creatures. You can bounce your own creature if you're killing your opponent too quickly. Most of the bounce spells that we have are to bounce an opposing creature. This lets us bounce our own or an opposing creature. Beyond that, it also only costs 4 mana. So even if it doesn't have any other effect, just having 4 mana to bounce a creature is a really good effect. This is going to be easy to cast regardless of what level your planeswalkers are, regardless of how the rest of your collection looks. This is going to be a really good throw-in card for a lot of blue decks. So I like this one a lot. Next up, we have Infernal Grasp. Once again, a very cheap removal card. It's 5 mana to destroy target creature and you lose 6 life. So the loss of 6 life is going to be pretty difficult on newer players that have lower level planeswalkers because a lot of the lower level Origins walkers start at around like 20, 22 health. And so losing 6 life at that range for Origins Liliana is pretty significant. However, if you've leveled up your planeswalkers at all, then this card is absolutely going to be worth it because chances are you're going to be destroying something that's going to be doing more than 6 damage to you in total. So the 5 mana to destroy a creature is really good. Way back in the Puzzle Quest days, we had a bunch of black spells that cost 5 mana to destroy creatures, and they were all really good. So having a new one that costs 5 mana, even with the drawback of losing 6 life, is going to be a phenomenal card that once again I see getting a lot of play. Next up, we have Rite of Oblivion. This is yet another very cheap removal card. It's 3 mana, your first creature gains imminent death, meaning that it loses a reinforcement every turn, every one of your turns, or it dies. Then you exile target opposing creature. So unless you cannot stack the imminent death from this, you could just repeatedly target the same zombie token stack and have a 3 mana to exile target opposing creature removal spell in your deck. Or humans, right? I mean, this is white-black, but nonetheless, I see this as just being a 3 mana, very easy to use to exile an opposing creature. I'm actually pretty interested to see what happens with this card with regards to if you have no creatures on the battlefield, if you can still cast it. If that is the case, then this card is going to be absolutely amazing. If that's not the case, then this will still be a very good card and is definitely going to be worthwhile for a lot of you newer players who need access to some kind of exile. I'm especially looking at that Tiamat node for the Adventure in the Forgotten Realms event because you can use this to exile your opponent's dragons instead of destroying them and having terrible things happen to you. The next card on the list is Thermo Alchemist. This is 0 mana for, it's 8 mana for a 0/3 with Defender. It has casting a spell, so every time you cast a spell, deal 3 damage to your opponent's Planeswalker. This, with Wizard class, is just game over. You play this, you've got Wizard class, you start drawing cards, and your opponent loses the game because you can just create some kind of sick loop that makes you draw like 20, 30, 40, 50 cards, and then even at like 30 cards, right? That's 90 damage to your opponent's face. The only downside to this card is that it has Defender, so you have to make sure that you play it and then start comboing off, or that your opponent just doesn't have creatures down. Otherwise, this thing will block your opponent's creatures and die. But nonetheless, the level of absolute damage that can be dealt to your opponent by a common is absolutely staggering to me. So this is a really, really good card. The final comment on the list and the final chase card that I have for the Midnight Hunt set is this Vengeful Strangler. It's 8 mana for a 2/1, and when this creature dies, target opposing creature gains Enchanted. At the beginning of your turn, destroy the first creature you control, and then you lose 3 life. I've mentioned Liliana Death's Majesty a number of times. If you anoint this thing, it dies, enters the battlefield, you select your opponent's creature that's in the last creature slot, and then watch as all of their creatures die because it destroys the first creature they control, and then it destroys the next creature they control, and then it destroys that one. And if your opponent winds up having multiple creatures, right? Let's say that they wind up playing more creatures, you just keep anointing this thing and you keep targeting the top thing on the stack. And then as you do that, everything starts slowly wiping away. So it will make it so that your opponent really can't have creatures down because between this thing and anoint, you're just going to get rid of all of your opponent's creatures. Even if you use this thing without the anoint ability, you nonetheless can still just play it on its own, target your opponent's last creature, and laugh as your opponent winds up destroying all of their creatures because this Vengeful Strangler died. So you do need to find a way to kill it. So that is the one downside to it, but it isn't like black doesn't have enough ways to kill its own creatures. Heck, you could even pair it with the Rite of Oblivion, have it gain imminent death, exile an opposing creature, whatever their biggest threat is, and then laugh as the rest of their creatures die to the Strangler. So that does it for my commons, uncommons, and rares. I hope that my guides have been helpful for you in determining which cards to keep an eye out for and which cards you want to target with your resources from the upcoming set. If I missed anything in the common, uncommon, or rare range that is in your chase list, go ahead, post it in the comments and let me know why. Why is it that you're chasing it, and what is it that you are hoping to do with it? I always love to see what you guys are doing with your cards. So with that, that's really it from me. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.